For more than a year, the safest place in the Pacific sky was above an American airfield in the dark. The Japanese worked this out before the Americans did. So night after night, they sent up a single airplane, like sometimes two, to circle a field with its engines thrown out of sync on purpose. And the throbbing, uneven drone that came down out of the black put 10,000 exhausted men flat on the ground, waiting for a bomb that most nights never came. The Marines on Guadalcanal called him Washing Machine Charlie. The name came from the sound. Two engines running at different speeds made a chugging beat that reminded farm boys of the one-cylinder motors on the Maytag ringers back home. A single-engine float plane that flew the same errand earned its own name, Louis the Louse. Some nights, Charlie dropped a bomb. Other nights, he dropped bottles, which whistle like falling ordnance on the way down, to rattle nerves and cost the Marines their sleep at no price to himself. The raids were never about wrecking Henderson Field. Their whole purpose was to grind the men who held it down to the bone, one broken night at a time, and they worked because the Americans had no way to stop them. The problem, seen from the ground, was close to unsolvable. A lone bomber shows up at 200 at 8,000 feet. The siren goes. Searchlights swing up and grope across the sky. Men roll into slit trenches. Somewhere a fighter claws for altitude, and its pilot, one of the best day flyers in the theater, can see nothing past the glow of his own exhaust stacks. He has no radar. The men on the ground trying to guide him have nothing worth the name either. He is being asked to find one airplane in a sky the size of a county, in the dark, by eye. A day pilot sent up after Charlie came home, having seen nothing but his own exhaust, and the raider slipped back to Rabaul or to its tender before dawn. The cost never showed up as craters. It showed up in the faces of men who had gone the better part of a week without real sleep. A rested rifleman digs his hole, sights his weapon, and keeps his head. A man 4 nights short of rest does none of it as well. And Charlie's whole trade was to mass-produce that second man across an entire garrison. So the pilots begged to go up and finish him. Some of the best flyers in the Solomons took a turn at it and came home with nothing. Because an airplane bred to win a turning fight in daylight is a blind animal once the sun goes down. Now and then, the searchlights found the bomber and held him in a white cone, and the men on the ground would cheer, and the interceptor would still not close the last mile, and the light would slide off him, and the drone would go on. That last part is the one worth sitting with. For most of 1942 and deep into 1943, the Japanese ran these missions across Guadalcanal and up the Solomons toward Munda and Bougainville at almost no cost. Cheap airplane, cheap crew, one bomb or a sack of bottles, and an enemy garrison stripped of rest. The float planes came off tenders and island anchorages. The Bettys came down the slot from Rabaul. The exchange rate favored Japan, and both sides understood it. The first American attempt to fix this was the obvious one, and it fell flat. The Army Air Forces took the Douglas A-20 Havoc, a twin-engine attack bomber, bolted crude radar into it, and called it the P-70. On paper, it was a night fighter. In practice, it could not climb high enough to reach the raiders. The ground radar it leaned on was close to non-existent in the islands, and the crews had next to no training in the strange new craft of hunting by instrument. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron brought P-70s to Guadalcanal in February 1943 and spent months proving that a poor night interceptor is only a slower way of not catching anyone. Charlie kept coming. The real answer was already taking shape, out of sight, thousands of miles from any island. In 1942, the Navy stood up a program it named Project Affirm and leaned hard on the radiation laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where physicists had spent the first years of the war learning how radio waves bounce off an airplane. The engineers took the Vought F-4U Corsair, the meanest day fighter in the Pacific, and rebuilt a small batch of them into something stranger. They fitted a radar set with an 18-inch dish inside a bulge on the leading edge of the right wing, wired a small scope into the center of the instrument panel, hung flame dampeners on the exhaust so the glare would not blind the pilot at the trigger, and pulled one of the 6 machine guns to make room for the weight. No more than 3 dozen of these were ever built. They were the F-4U-2, the least known Corsairs of the war, and one pilot who flew them swore the fat radar pod on the wing made the machine handle better. The Navy commissioned VFN-75 as its first night fighter squadron on the 10th of April 1943 under Lieutenant Commander William Widhelm. The men in it were no beginners. Several had logged more than 2,000 hours, which in 1943 made them old men. They learned the trade in a way no one ever had. Instructors flew them at night in SBD Dauntless dive bombers, wired with radar, one veteran and one student to a plane, so the older man could talk the younger through his first blind intercept from the back seat. Then the students climbed into the F4U-2 themselves and practiced being talked onto a target by a stranger on the ground. They studied ship and aircraft recognition wearing red goggles to hold their night vision. During one such run at Cherry Point that October, a student making an overhead pass clipped one of the dive bombers and tore off his own radome in the collision. Both machines landed in one piece. It was slow, unglamorous, electronic work, and almost none of the men who did it became famous for it. Night fighting is not glamorous, but it is specialized in every degree, as one sergeant in the trade put it, and he had it right on both counts. Then they went to war. On the 1st of August 1943, 6 pilots and 6 of those rebuilt Corsairs were pulled out and sent to the raw forward strip at Munda on New Georgia with orders that came to a single sentence: clear the sky of Washing Machine Charlie. It took them until Halloween. On the night of the 31st of October 1943, a Marine ground control team on Vella La Vella caught an inbound Betty on its scope. The controllers were Major Thomas Hicks and a staff sergeant named Eugene Gleason, and their entire job was to sit in the dark, reading a glowing tube and speak headings into a radio. They turned Lieutenant Hugh O'Neill of VFN 75 out over the water, closing him, correcting him, until his own airborne set caught the bomber and his eyes caught its exhaust glow, and he fired and sent the Betty down off Vella La Vella. It was the first air-to-air kill by a radar-equipped night fighter in the Pacific Fleet, and by most accounts, the first radar-guided night kill in American history. That is the night the arithmetic flipped. For a year, the Raider had held every advantage the dark could hand him. Now, a man he never saw had been steered to within a few hundred feet of his tail by a voice reading a screen, and the darkness had quit protecting him. There are a lot of these stories that never get told, and most of them never get looked up. Subscribing is how you make sure we keep telling them. And if you hit subscribe, you will get a new one every week. The kill off Vella La Vella was no lucky shot. It was the output of a chain that ran from a radar antenna on a hilltop, through a controller's headset into a pilot's earphones, and at last onto a 3-inch scope glowing in the cockpit. The ground set found the Raider first and fixed his heading and height. The controller turned the fighter until the 2 blips began to merge, then handed him to his own airborne radar, which reached out about 1.5 miles. Inside that last mile, the pilot took over by eye, hunting the pale flare of exhaust against a black sky. Every step in the chain could fail: a worn-out controller, a bad vector, a set gone soft in the damp island air, and the bomber went home. When every step held, the bomber fell into the sea. What came next, the Japanese felt before they understood it. One night, a plane went out and did not come back. The next night, another failed to return. In the New Georgia area, after that Halloween kill, the Raiders that ventured over were run down with a consistency that had not existed a month before. VFN 75 and the Marine Squadron, working the same water, kept scoring, and the result showed up on the far side of the ledger as a plain, cold count. More and more of the night-flying airplanes were failing to come home. A harassment mission is worth flying only while it stays cheap. Once the cheap airplane turned into a one-way trip, the whole logic of the campaign fell apart. From Rabaul, the change must have looked like bad luck at first, and then like something worse. There was no new fighter parked on the American strips by daylight, nothing for a reconnaissance camera to catch, nothing to brief a crew about. The field looked the same as it had all summer, yet the airplane that had circled it 100 times without a scratch now flew out and did not answer the radio, and the crew that had flown the milk run all season did not come back to say what had changed. The Japanese kept feeding men into it for a while, the way men do before they accept that the odds have turned, and the controllers on Vella La Vella and at Munda kept reading their screens and calling the headings, and the tally climbed. The Marines flying the same beat worked out of PV-1 Ventura's twin-engine patrol bombers shoved into the night fighter role, and they gave their machines names. One was Coral Princess. Another was Chloe. The Gray Ghosts opened their account at 18 minutes past 4 on the morning of the 14th of November. when destroyer-based fighter directors coached Coral Princess onto an enemy plane. Chloe scored in February, driven up to 15,000 feet over Dampier Strait to walk 3 bursts of 50 caliber fire into a Betty of the 751st Air Group. The wreckage and an oil slick turned up the next morning. The Japanese did not fly only against airfields. They flew against ships, and a torpedo-carrying Betty coming in low over the water at night was a far worse thing than a nuisance over a runway. In the last weeks of 1943, that threat rose against the fast carriers, and the Navy's answer to it cost the service one of its most famous men. Edward O'Hare was already a legend. 18 months before, off Rabaul, he had ripped into a formation of Bettys bearing down on the Lexington and been credited with knocking several of them out of the sky almost single-handed, which made him the Navy's first ace of the war and won him the Medal of Honor. Commanding the air group on the Enterprise during the Gilbert's landings, he took on a harder puzzle. Enemy torpedo planes were stalking the flat tops after dark, so O'Hare rigged a way to fight them. A radar-equipped TBF Avenger flying with a pair of Hellcats, the Avenger's radar man hunting the target and steering the fighters onto it. He called it the Black Panther team. On the night of the 26th of November 1943, O'Hare led the first night fighter mission ever flown off an American carrier. Out over the water, in the muddle of the rendezvous, a lone Betty slid in behind the Hellcats. The Avenger's turret gunner, a young sailor named Alvin Kernan, saw it and opened up. The Betty's gunner fired back, and O'Hare's Hellcat dropped out of formation and vanished into the black and was never found. For 54 years, the fleet assumed its own gunner had hit him by mistake. Then, in 1997, 2 historians working through the Japanese Air Group's own records concluded the fatal rounds had probably come from the Betty's nose gun, a thin 7.7 millimeter piece with a 100-round drum on top, fired in a few short bursts by a man who never even claimed a kill. The American accounts and the enemy reports still agree on almost nothing, except that recognition lights on the Hellcats came on at the worst possible instant. The experiment that killed O'Hare was the right idea anyway. When Lieutenant Commander Richard Harmer took a detachment of the new night hunters aboard the carriers and downed a Betty near Truk in the first weeks of 1944, then splashed 3 more over the following nights, the fleet stopped dreading the dark. The Corsair had shown the way, but the airplane that carried the night war forward was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, kinder to a pitching deck and available in numbers the F4U-2 never approached. By August 1944, the Navy had gone a step further and put a whole air group trained for the dark Night Air Group 41 aboard the light carrier Independence, its Hellcats and Avengers built around the work O'Hare had died testing. For the first time, an American task force could keep trained hunters over itself around the clock. The radar-nosed F6F-5N became the fleet's standard set of eyes after dark, and it would hold that job well past the end of the war. By the middle of 1944, the Army at last had the machine it should have started with. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow was the first aircraft in American service drawn from a blank sheet to do one thing: hunt other airplanes in the dark. It was huge, a twin-boom monster painted glossy black, crewed by 3, carrying a nose packed with radar and 4 20mm cannon in its lower fuselage. On the night of the 30th of June 1944, a Black Widow of the 6th Night Fighter Squadron, an airplane its crew had christened Moon Happy, caught a Betty over Saipan and shot it down, the first kill by a P-61 anywhere. Across the Marianas that summer, the night raiders that had worked every American beachhead since Guadalcanal flew into a hunter that could find them in full dark and hit them with the broadside of a small warship. In one 5-day stretch that December, Black Widow crews knocked down 8 Japanese airplanes, and after that, there came fewer and fewer nights when anything rose to meet them at all. And then the sky went quiet. The night fighters did not empty that sky by themselves, and it would be false to say they did. By late 1944, Japan was losing its forward fields, its airplanes, and above all, its trained crews faster than any of it could be replaced, and a country that cannot mount a raid by day, cannot keep one going after dark. From inside a Japanese air group, though, the reason a harassment flight stopped being worth the fuel was concrete and close at hand. It was the empty revetment where last night's airplane should have stood. The Americans had built a system, radar sets and ground controllers and a training school and a few dozen strange airplanes that turned the dark from a shield into a trap. And the men who ran that system are, to this day, all but nameless outside a handful of unit histories. There is a quiet irony in how it ended. The night fighter squadrons had done their job so well that by 1945 they were running short of things to intercept, some of them going whole months without a single aerial kill because nothing came up to be killed. So the men who had been built and trained and shipped halfway around the world to hunt airplanes in the dark hung rockets and napalm under their wings and went looking for targets on the ground instead. And the black-painted machines spent the last year of the war strafing roads and airfields because the thing they were made to catch had stopped flying. On the last night of the war, a black widow named Lady in the Dark ran a Japanese fighter down off Ishima, near Okinawa, and forced it into the sea without firing a shot, a fitting close, because by then, the night sky those raiders had once owned outright belonged to someone else, and they had learned at a price not to come.